Welcome to the limited series of the Iran Brief by All Things Policy, where we bring to you the latest updates from the ongoing West Asia war. We examine the key pressure points, the possible endgames, and what it means for the rest of the world. The Iran war is now entering its fourth week, and we see no signs of de escalation. Missile strikes continue to reshape the region, and diplomatic channels remain largely frozen. Um, and the world is mostly anxiously watching as the energy crisis unfolds. I'm Ashwara Sonavni, and today I sit with Anupam Manor and Aditya Ramanathan to discuss the West Asian conflict. Anupam, let's start with the most pressing issue when it comes to this. What is the immediate consequence when it comes to energy?
Yeah, we're already seeing extreme kind of reactions or unexpected lines, of course, but it is kind of extreme for the global economy. Before the war, just to kind of set this thing in context, before the war, I think the energy prices, oil prices, Brent crude was at about $65 per barrel. In the third week or so, it touched 100. And, a few days back, it touched 120, right? And in certain markets, it was up to 126. So clearly now it's come back a little bit to 105, 106, but you can expect now it to be in the range of 100 to 120 odd, right? And that is severe. So that'll have deep ramifications for the entire global economy. Various kind of countries which are highly energy kind of dependent. It'll have repercussions on second and third order effects. The thing with oil, as against anything else, is that oil prices tend to send shockwaves across the economy. Everything else will get expensive, right? So I think that is where economists and policymakers across the world are watching out for. And just to kind of give again an idea of this, about 20 million barrels pass through the Strait of Hormuz, right, in 2025, for example, per day, that is, per day, right? So that's about, and on top of that, about one fifth of global LNG trade also passed through the Strait of Hormuz. So this is a big deal in terms of overall energy supply. It's not just oil; it's LPG, LNG, and oil. All of that you're seeing blockades. You're seeing severe kind of shortages. Just to again one final bit, it's not just the physical blockade. I think most people picture it to be a physical blockade where where ships are not allowed to pass through, etc. But I think it's also to do with the financial aspect of it. Insurance premiums have gone through the roof. They're at a 6-year high. This was a 6-year high ahead of the strikes, by the way. So because there was already kind of ideas that there was build up, there was going to conflict. So we're talking about a 1 month time frame back. Insurance premiums had already reached 6 years high. Now it is absolutely through the roof, right? So the strait might not be formally kind of closed, but the withdrawal of all kinds of commercial companies, major oil operators, insurance companies not willing to just even underwrite these things, I think that has what has caused a de facto closure. So it's not a physical blockade, right? So that's, I think, something to look out for. And this is not going to ease up anytime soon. So I think you can expect oil prices to kind of remain high for some time to come.
And I mean, the immediate, if you could walk us through what this means for India, because I recently saw reports that a few Indian vessels have been allowed to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Do you think that would uh, improve the current energy crisis? I wouldn't call it crisis, but the current energy situation in India right now.
I think you can call it an crisis. I'd say parts of it is a crisis. LPG, at least for sure, given that prices have gone up. Of course, it's controlled by the government, but if you had a free market mechanism, prices would have shot up through the roof. As it is, I think LPG cylinders, there is severe shortage. Commercial establishments are not getting it. I wrote a paper on this recently just to see how much this is affected, right? So I think there's always room for self promotion, so I'm doing it shamelessly here. But yeah, there is a crisis. There is a shortage of LPG and so on. Right? In terms of oil, of course, we are slightly more diversified in our supply, or at least we've been allowed to buy oil from Russia, so that kind of helps. But in terms of LPG, we don't have that kind of diversification. So there is a shortage of LPG.
So I want to ask you on this. You know, where is the slack in the system? So you have, yes, Russian oil, but there's going to be greater demand for it. It's going to be available at a higher price. Um, as far as other options, there's the east-west pipeline across the Arabian Peninsula. Uh, but so you can possibly start moving some oil through the Red Sea. But that's ultimately dependent on the Houthis not doing their thing, right? So
Yeah.
I'm actually a bit surprised, Anupam, that oil prices haven't actually gone up even higher. I wonder if traders are actually pricing in the potential for a long conflict, and what happens at that point. Second, on gas, I want to ask: is India the worst affected, or among the worst affected countries, or aren't other countries also going to start feeling this impact, especially countries that use natural gas for power generation at a much higher, larger scale?
Um, I'll take the second one. India is slightly more affected than other countries, and that's largely because India is overly dependent on LPG and LNG coming from the Gulf as against others, right?
Mhm.
So, and that's because of the kind of a particular mixing ratio that we use. We use more butane than propane, and we don't have the infrastructure to kind of switch overnight. And that's the main reason why we are stuck in this. Whereas, you could diversify, and I think in the long run we should. We can buy natural gas from Russia, from Australia. By the way, we have a long-term contract with Australia. We can, but all of them use more propane than butane, right? So I think that is one of the reasons why India is particularly feeling the pinch with natural gas and LPG than others. So one, I think long term, I mean, this might be out of syllabus per se, but I think long term we have to fix just this mixing
Mhm.
infrastructure at our importing ports such that we'll have greater diversification in terms of sources. But in terms of oil, I think you will see prices continuing to rise. But you would also perhaps see the non-Gulf oil producing nations to kind of really pick up the slack on some of these things. So it could be Norway, it could be Venezuela, of course, or US shale oil and other regions kind of picking up on production of oil. To some extent, I think that can ease, but I think you will see sustained kind of increase in oil prices for until the war eases.
Yeah, I mean, all of those options exist, but ramping up production is not an easy thing. And similarly with shale, I mean, you can leave fields, you can leave basically your wells to idle, but getting them started takes a while. Uh, my other question is, from what I understand, I think the Americans have already depleted their SPR a long time back during the Ukraine war and didn't bother to fill up when prices were low. I just feel like countries haven't been taking this seriously at all.
No, I not at all. And in fact, so during the COVID war, I mean during the COVID crisis, when oil prices fell to you remember the time when oil futures fell to like $0 per
Mhm.
barrel. In fact, shipping companies had to pay countries to take oil
Oil.
from. That is when every single country should have filled up its SPR reserves, right? India did to
Mhm.
some extent, but we didn't have enough capacity, and we've not built really a lot after that, right? But I think hopefully from here on, we countries should take this a lot more seriously in terms of having underground caverns, and there are a lot of options, by the way, in terms of how do you fill up oil, how do you store oil, etc., right? And oil is much easier to store than LPG. The cost involved in storing LPG is far greater because it has to be kept at a pressure, temperature cooled, etc., whereas oil you can do, you have slightly more liberty in that. You can even have, like, there are floating islands of oil reserves that you can have, right?
That's right.
In big
Mhm.
drums and so on. But I think we should now explore all of these options. In India, particularly, we have 3 or 4 underground caverns. But we can, for example, there are oil storage facilities in Sri Lanka that we can this thing. There are you can rent oil storage facilities. Of course, unfortunately, most of that is in the Middle East,
Sure.
but which is going to be problematic now. But again, that should be part of the options.
Yeah, I think it's going to really, hopefully, impact the way we deal with our energy resources. But coming back to the point where you said, and we'll keep talking about the energy situation, but when you said that when the war eases, and that's an interesting point to pivot to you. I think in this conflict, Ali Larijani's death remains extremely crucial. He played a central role in the 2015 nuclear deal, was in back-channel talks with Europe. Israel killing Larijani essentially has, you know, destroyed a scope for any off ramps at this point. There is low appetite in the Iranian regime or Israel or the US to sort of de escalate. So, just to understand, what is Iran's theory of victory? We've already seen US get into this war with the idea of regime change, and that goalpost has effectively shifted now to God knows what. But let's focus on Iran for a moment. What is Iran's theory of victory?
Yeah, let's try and answer that. I mean, if you look at the war aims that Israel and the US initially started out with Israel, it's probably regime change, or the consolation prize
Mhm.
being destroying Iranian space state capacity, basically degrading it to the point where Iran is so unstable. Basically, it becomes like Syria in the 2010s. So
Mhm.
Iran has its own problems to deal with and can't create problems for others. Uh, the American war aims were clear as mud from day one, and the advantage of that is potentially that the U.S. leadership can pivot and call it a day and say, "Well, we've won, we've done what we needed to do, and we can get out." As far as Iran is concerned, unlike say with the 12-day war in 2025, if you're Iran, you don't want to end this without some gains or the other. I mean, this might sound paradoxical because the Iranians have been very badly hurt, but they also don't want to repeat of this.
Mhm.
And what I think the perception that the Iranians have right now is that they're in the driver's seat. So I think the theory of victory is, I think, based on three assumptions. One is coercion, the application of pain. We talked about the Strait of Hormuz. So the Iranians are applying pressure on choke
Mhm.
points. So there's the physical geographic choke point of the Strait of Hormuz, obviously, and it's very specific geography that makes it hard for other countries to come and establish full sea control. There's also other things. For example, there are nodes like storage infrastructure that you can target that can
Mhm.
create a lot of pain for other countries, right? So, Iraq has, I think, basically shut down a chunk of production simply because it doesn't have the storage facilities. So things like
Mhm.
that. Uh,
You were telling me about Qatar and them closing fields as well. Yeah,
Yes, yeah, all of that. So there's a lot of pain, but I think it's being calibrated in the sense, or at least the Iranian theories, it's being calibrated. Iran is being the sensible strangler, the amenable strangler. It doesn't want to strangle you to death, but it wants compliance.
Mhm.
So Iran is looking for concessions which allow it to secure its regime and prevent a repeat of what it's been seeing over the last few years. Uh, the second is that the Iranians want to drag this as long as possible. As far as they're concerned, they have more time than, especially the United States. The US, there are all sorts of constraints from markets to domestic politics.
Mhm.
All of those are good incentives for Donald Trump to wind this down as possible.
Especially with the midterms
Yes.
this year. Yeah.
So they'd want to wind this down as soon as
Mhm.
possible. Uh, the Iranians are willing to drag it out. And their theory, I think, there is that if they drag it out, ultimately the Gulf countries are going to say, well, enough is enough. Let's end this. We'll try and learn to live with Iran.
and the rest of the world, right?
Yeah.
Because when oil prices
Mhm.
go up and there could be a global recession or a stagflation, I mean, we can talk about economic projections later, but eventually the rest of the world will start putting pressure on America and
Mhm.
Trump. I mean, of course, Trump might be immune to, let's say, sensibilities of the world, but nonetheless, that's going to hit at some point, even purely from a perception point. US is now being seen as the kind of a global villain, right? And when Europe starts turning, and they've already started, right?
Yeah.
I think that will
Yeah.
have ramifications.
Yeah. I mean, just the economic impact enough itself should be,
Yeah.
a pressure point for the Americans.
And also, we saw the NATO allies who have refused to support Trump in this war. So I think that these are also some
Yeah.
indications.
I mean, for perspective, for example, NATO never participated in the Vietnam War and
Right.
so on, right?
Yeah.
So there are, they didn't participate in Iraq. They participated as NATO in Afghanistan because Article
Yeah.
5 was invoked.
Mhm.
That was a very clear cut case. But anyway, so that's the second point. The third, I think, is the assumption, which is that there are military developments that allow them, that give the offense advantage. So we know what that means. It's mostly using relatively cheap missiles as well as drones. So the Iranian belief is that the Americans will run out of targets sooner than they will. the Gulf countries have lots of busy ports and fancy hotels and all of which can be hit. The Iranians have less of those, and Iranian air defenses have already been degraded. A lot of their launches have been taken out. So what else do you hit in Iran after a point? So there's that, and that also applies at sea in that because you have these cheap vectors, it becomes harder to establish sea control in littoral environments. Now, gaining control of littoral environments has always been hard. It's always harder than in deep waters, but there are periods of time when it gets harder. In the early 20th century, with sea mines, with small torpedo boats, and then later with air power, that became hard, and then it took a while for navies to essentially wrest that control back. We're seeing that process repeat again. So we're probably in the beginning of a historical interlude, a period in which, once again, it becomes really hard for navies to operate close to land. We've seen that in 2022 with the Black Sea coast of Ukraine, and 2023 in the Red Sea with the Houthis. So I think there's good evidence that that's going to persist, and it's not just about the specific geography of the Strait of Hormuz, which is itself a problem. And so there's that. So all of these that's basically how Iran, thinks it's going to win. It's going to win by applying calibrated pressure, or by doing it over a long period of time, and by taking advantage of military developments. Now, there are problems with this. The most obvious one to me is the assumption that the Gulf states will become more amenable to Iran. Right now, these countries ultimately depend on a great deal of stability for their own prosperity. And the last thing they want is an Iran that might become a problem again a year or two down the line. So in that sense, their calculation is not very different from Iran's, which is that Iran also doesn't want this to continue forever. So that's one thing. The second is that, some of these, there are paradoxical effects from some of these things. So Iran might, for example, be looking at, we're recording this on Friday, Iran might be looking at imposing a toll to allow more energy to flow out of the Strait of Hormuz. So that gives them money. That's great. The problem is it also reduces the pressure on the global economy and on Donald Trump, right? So that actually gives them more leeway to fight Iran. And finally, from what I understand, Iran has done the way that the command and control in the armed forces is working is in the military and the IRGCs, that it's fairly decentralized. Now, that's really good for survivability. It's really good for maintaining operational tempo. It's not necessarily good for calibration because once you have delegated those responsibilities, there are all sorts of potential effects that you could have. Some very enthusiastic officer might decide to target gas infrastructure in another country and stuff like that. So there's issues like that. To me, the biggest concern that I have is that all parties are probably digging in. I don't know about the US, but Israel, the Gulf countries, and Iran are all digging in for a long fight. And I think that to my mind is the scariest part.
We did see a strong condemnation from the Arab world just yesterday, where Saudi Arabia met with foreign ministers of Qatar, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, even Pakistan in Riyadh, and they collectively issued a condemnation that said deliberate Iranian attacks. So the Gulf has taken a unified position. It's also interesting for me to see Pakistan in the list, because that essentially shows how this conflict has expanded from West Asia to the Indian subcontinent. And of course, these are the countries, even India, Pakistan, these are the countries who will face the heat of both the military and the energy crisis of it. But I'm curious to know, coming back to the defense of it, what is holding back? We heard a lot about Iran deploying sea mines. What's the situation with that? What is holding Iran back from deploying sea mines at present?
I think it's about calibration. So I think mining the Strait of Hormuz and blocking it off is not a big deal. We can go into the details, but the way that the gradient of the seabed works is that it's gradual towards the Iranian coast, so it's fairly shallow, and then there's a deep plunge. There's a trench in which is something like 600 meters deep. I'm forgetting, but basically it's where ships can move most easily. Including VLCCs and the likes. So it's actually fairly easy to mine. The other thing you can do is simply at the narrowest part of the strait, you can simply plonk rusty old tankers there. You can just put them there, blow them up, let them sink, and you again block a lot of the strait. So actually blocking it off is not that complicated for Iran. Uh, the but there are challenges with that. One, they can't then export oil themselves, so they're going to run out of money. They once you do that, it basically, there's no reason for any other country to show restraint. There's no reason for any other country to destroy uh, Iran's oil infrastructure. There's no reason for other countries have a very clear-cut reason to then go and forcibly open up the strait. So for Iran at the moment, they're still, I think, calibrating this. Uh, Look, it's an obvious example, but the first 2 years of the First World War, Germans were very careful, or relatively careful, about what their submarines targeted, and then the last 1.5 years, they moved to unrestricted submarine warfare, and that had the effect of basically upsetting every other country, and it precipitated, for example, the American entry into the war. So there's a reason why you want to calibrate this, even when you're in a fight for your own existence.
Anupam, I would like to come back to you and again talk about the economic situation. If you could give us a medium to long term economic forecast on what the world GDP looks like and how it will affect not just the world, not just India, but also the broader world.
Yeah, so I think we'd have to start off with kind of making predictions on how long the war will last, because everything will depend on that. So let's do this on a scenario analysis.
Yeah, yesterday we just sat down in a room and we were just doing various scenario building exercises.
And none of them gave us much optimism.
Yeah. So though now this might be moot, but if this turns out to be a short war, we're already kind of on the edge of what, at the definition of what a short war would be. But if this happens to be a short war, surprisingly, the global impact will be very little. As in it's easier for the economy, let's say by a miracle in the next 10-15 days, everything kind of de-escalates, you can restart oil wells. Yes, you'd have a little bit of an energy surge, but you can get over that, right? Within 2-3 months, everything will be back to normal. The US would still be expected to grow at about 2.25%, etc., which is quite good. A little bit of hit obviously here and there, but not too much damage done, right?
Sorry, I want to intervene right here and just ask you that even if we reach to the first phase of war, which means the Strait of Hormuz is opened, there are no direct attacks in Gulf countries. Maybe Israel and Iran are still launching missiles in each other's territories, but even then, would that impact the economy?
So if it is just that, if it is not spreading to other Gulf countries, and if the strait is open, I think the world will just carry on. Like we've adjusted
with
to
the Russia-Ukraine
war,
conflict,
the world will move on. I think if there's any particular dependencies on Iran, with maybe a little bit of oil, but I think that is okay, right? I mean, the world will move on. And I'm saying this as objectively as I possibly could, right? But as long as the strait is closed, or at least impeded in severe way, and if the other Gulf countries are involved, then I think it'll start having, as we said, the ramifications, right? So if you expect this to move to several months, then you would see, for example, the Eurozone to contract, not contract, maybe, again, depends. If it is a 6 to 8 months period, then Eurozone will only grow at about 0.5%. Anything beyond, you would actually expect the Eurozone to contract, right? So negative GDP growth. And that would mean, of course, if the Eurozone contracts, then the rest of the world exporting to Europe as a big player, as a big market, you would have exports hit, and that will kind of spread. Chinese economic growth will be hit, again, with high energy prices. If we think that the oil price would hit about $130 and remain at that for some time, the Chinese economy will be hit. And once the Chinese economy is hit, you can expect a ripple effect going around, right? So the prediction of sorts, and take this with a big pinch of salt, etc., because anytime a macroeconomist makes a prediction, I think it's best if you discard it. But nonetheless, right, the prediction is that you could have a stagflation kind of scenario, which is a situation in which you have low GDP growth, or kind of even a decelerating economy, along with high inflation. And I think that, history at least suggests that is what could happen. 1973 again, oil crisis. You had a stagflation. You had a similar kind of stagflation in 1978. So on. So you could see this kind of, at least a repeat. Whenever oil prices shoot up, you have inflation, and then production goes down because of that. You tend to have a stagflation kind of scenario, right? But what is for sure certain is that the Gulf countries will be hit. So you can see, for example, Iraq's GDP would be hit by about 3.5% negative, 3.5% growth. You can think about Saudi Arabia, UAE, all of them kind of contracting by 3 to 5%, and that's significant. And that will have ramifications because Indians obviously working there might lose jobs, remittances might come down, they might start coming back. So there's, the ripple effects will always be there. And I think that is something that you got to look out for. Inflation, again, global inflation is set to kind of go up quite significantly by 1 or 2 percentage points, which is again quite significant. And that oil will be the kind of big, the driver of that kind of inflation. But there are some other effects as well, if I might take the liberty of just talking about things which, you wouldn't really think about, but overall shipping costs have gone up. Of course, anything that passes through the Strait of Hormuz, but even otherwise, shipping costs have gone up. Carriers have started increasing. Risk insurance premium has gone up. It was about 0.2% of vessel value before the war. Now it's about 1% of vessel value. And that's quite a bit, So if you think about an LNG carrier going, costing about, having value of about 150 million. Now, insurance cost alone will be 1.5 million. And that's quite a bit, right? So, the various kind of shipping estimates say that now container costs, what they charge customers, has gone up to about $3,500 per container, etc., etc. And these are significant things. So even though you might not be directly linked to oil or just this, you'll start seeing kind of second order effects of this. Something that I didn't really think about or I didn't know too much about is that a lot of fertilizer production happens in the Middle East and it passes through the Strait of Hormuz. So now you might have urea and fertilizer prices going up. Urea is of course a high nitrogen fertilizer. That in fact rose 19%. Prices rose within a week of this thing starting. And India, by the way, is highly dependent on urea and other fertilizers. So and that is financed or subsidized largely by the union government. So now you can have effects on the fiscal side of things. So I'm just giving you a picture of how things might get affected. I'll give you another thing, right? Which I didn't know about. The Gulf states are the biggest producers of helium. And helium is used for semiconductors production. And so you might have, spike in semiconductors. Therefore, you might see spikes in price of smartphones. All of this, of course, assuming that the war will stand for some. If it is a little bit, you'll have stocks, you'll have storage, you'll have, redundancies a little bit built in. But if this stands for some time, I think you'll start seeing, price hikes in a whole bunch of these things, right? Air freight costs have gone up because now you can't go through the Middle East. You're taking longer routes. You're seeing a whole bunch of things. Air freights have gone up by 45%, for example.
Especially for India, when the Pakistan airspace is already shut. Now the Iranian airspace is shut.
Exactly.
So Indians have to take a longer route.
Yeah.
And when you talk about all of this, this means the closure of Strait of Hormuz. And I think Iran knows what it's doing by blocking the Strait of Hormuz. And one of the yesterday's scenario building exercises, one of the things that we discussed, Aditya, was is this a pressure tactic for Iran to deter the Gulf from housing American military bases, and how effective would that be? Because right now, I would assume that Gulf is not very happy with the security reassurances that was promised by the Americans.
Yeah, the Gulf seems to be angry with Iran, but they're also equally angry with the US, or at least that's the kind of feeling vibes I'm getting. So would that hold true?
Yeah. So, that's, the bet that Iran is making is that they're going to be more angry with the US than they are with them. And the bet the Americans are making is that they're going to be more angry with Iran. But it's not a good place to be for the Gulf states. One of Iran's war aims will definitely be for these countries to either to put an end to those basic rights, or to limit them in some way.
Mhm.
But it's really hard for these countries because it's not just about protection from Iran. It's more about just being a broader security provider. The U.S.
Mhm.
Navy, does help for its own interests, help secure the world's oceans. One reason why insurance rates are relatively manageable around the world is because you have this one big dominant navy, um, that's basically keeping the sea lanes open, keeping them secure. So I think the fact that that broader security is provided to these countries, for whom shipping is absolutely essential for their survival. I think it makes it really hard for them to give up that at this stage, to give up that dependence on the United States. Uh, there are things that can further complicate their own calculations. Uh, Israel is right now engaged in a campaign in southern Lebanon where something like 800,000 people have been displaced.
Yeah.
So if the Gulf countries decide to be part of this war with Iran, some people
Mhm.
in their own countries might ask, does that also mean that you're party to the war in Lebanon now?
Mhm.
These countries
Yeah.
would say no.
Yeah.
We're not coordinating with Israel, but those sort of complications do exist. So it's a very hard time to be one of the Gulf Arab states. And one of the paradoxes, Anupam, what you talked about, urea, fertilizers, helium. Uh, these Gulf Arab states did what everybody thought they should do, which is to diversify, to go up the value chain. They're doing all that. And the paradox of that is that uh, when those countries are under attack, or when those countries, when their choke points are being strangled, everybody else in the world suffers even more.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
be careful what you wish for.
That's true.
And I don't like to bring in Pakistan again. However, the question of the Pakistan Saudi Arabia Strategic Mutual Security Agreement is also fascinating, where Pakistan has demonstrated willingness, where they said that yes, if Saudi Arabia needs us, we'll come to their rescue. Again, we saw during the Afghanistan war that Saudi Arabia maintained a very neutral position, but there's always that aspect, there's always that threat for the war to expand to a certain extent to the Indian subcontinent. But I'm interested in how where I want to go back to where the war actually began. What does this mean for Iran's race to the bomb?
Wow. Okay.
Mhm.
So Iran can still potentially do its race to the bomb. The problem is that you need other things. So you have some amount of uranium, something like maybe 450 kilos, which you can bring to bomb grade level over a few months. The problem is, so a few things. You need a lot of supporting infrastructure, including energy. People need to be able to move. Um, then the other problem is when you are, the most dangerous phase is the race to the bomb,
Mhm.
um, because it's exactly when you are there that other countries are going to pull out all stops to try and prevent you from getting there. So that's a dangerous uh, a- time, a dangerous place for the Iranians to be. But it gets more complicated than that, because even if you say you get the enriched uranium, you are then able to weaponize it, put it into a device, then you're able to mate it to a missile, because Iranians don't really have a fixed wing air force. Uh, what that so by that, even if you get to that stage, you still need to have enough bombs,
Mhm.
you need and missiles. You need to be able to distribute them for survivability. You need to have a command and control structure, and all of those things take a lot of time.
Mhm.
And when you're still in that phase, that nascent stage, you make a very tempting target.
Mhm.
So this is a really it's a really bad time, paradoxically, for the Iranians to be pursuing the bomb.
And we've discussed nuclear deterrence several times at Takshashila, and I think that deserves its own podcast. So I'll hold on to that. But I would like some closing thoughts from both of you.
Closing thoughts. I would say again, the thing to look out for is energy prices.
Mhm.
Everything else flows from that, and even for India, of course, our fiscal situation, our inflation, even growth will be linked to energy prices, both LPG and oil. So I think that's the one thing to look out for, how
Mhm.
the markets react. In all of this, I've not even spoken about stock markets. People's, a lot of people's wealth has been significantly reduced because of this. So, and of course, globally, this has been happening. India's, I think, stock markets have been crashing almost this thing for the last few days. So, that is a whole bunch of things that is happening on the economic front that you got to look out for. I would say that's the
Yeah. To add to the gloom, I'll say that we should not make the assumption that this will be a short war, because who gets to gain from it? Everybody's
Mhm.
losing money. I mean, that was the logic in September 1980 when the Iran-Iraq war started. So widespread assumption that this couldn't last more than a few weeks. It
And
lasted,
then 1988.
yes,
The
8 years,
war was
but
still.
it wasn't just those 8 years. It direct consequence of that was Iraq's annexation or attempted annexation of Kuwait, which led to the Gulf War, which led to America's second war in 2003, which led to ultimately Iraq's civil war and ISIS, and we can go on. So, I think it would be imprudent of us to imagine that this is going to be a short war. We should be prepared for something potentially prolonged. Yeah.
yeah.
On that somber
No,
note.
let me just add to I mean, just the idea that none of these things at this global scale is just a one-off event. I think anybody who tends to think of this as, oh, we're just going to go bomb that
Mhm.
change regime and move forward, I think is idiotic. I mean, nothing short of that. I could find a more polite word, but it doesn't deserve it, right? Any war that you take, and again, this deserves a podcast on its own, but I can link what happened in Paul Volcker's era in the US in terms of Federal Rate reserves, and I can directly connect that to the Vietnam War, right? And so on and so forth. You can do this. Everything is like a long chain, in historical terms. This will have ramifications that we can't even think of. As he said, it could be the birth of a new terrorist organization. It could be this thing, but interest rates will react to this. And this will be for a long time to come already.
Mhm.
Already. So, yeah. This is not a small, simple, or one-off event that it just starts and stops.
That's
Yeah.
what they say, right? You can plan the day one of the war, and everything else is just a domino effect.
Yeah, I
that
mean, you can
happens
plan
before.
operationally, and then
Yeah.
you have to keep revising that. The problem
Yeah.
thing is that a badly conceived war,
Mhm.
it causes, it can have lots of really bad long-term effects, and the people paying the price are not necessarily the people who started this badly conceived war.
Always. On that very somber note, thank you, Aditya and Anupam. To our listeners, we are maintaining a West Asian tracker on Takshashila's main page, where we'll be posting daily updates, our analysis, our podcasts, our newsletter, all on West Asia. And thank you for tuning in.
Thank you. Thanks, Aisha.
Thank you.